My name is Jackie Malton. I was a detective with the Metropolitan Police for over 25 years. My real-life experiences on the front line as a woman investigating crime became the inspiration for the TV drama Prime Suspect. Oh, good morning, Pete. My name's Jackie Malton. Once a detective, always a detective. It never leaves. And now I'm going back on the road, on the job, and I'm looking at some of the worst crimes ever committed in the UK and the USA. In a series of exclusive interviews, I'll be talking one-to-one to detectives and experts to find out how they brought the killer to justice. This is the story of what it takes to find the real prime suspect. The case I'm looking at today is one of the most complex investigations in British crime history. A series of rapes committed in and around London between 1982 and 1986, culminating in the murder of 3 women by John Duffy and David Mulcahy. What's very unusual about the murders and the rapes is that it was committed across different force areas by 2 men working together and egging each other on and instigating their crimes by saying, shall we go out hunting for their victims of prey. But 2 of them were both getting satisfaction from raping and violence committed on them. I'm going to speak to Paul Dockley, who's a senior detective in Hertfordshire Police. It's really important to get an idea of the complications and complexities of an investigation such as this. Good afternoon, Paul Dockley. My name's Jackie Malton, ex-detective from the Met.
Hi, Jackie.
I'd love to come and speak to you, Paul, if I may. One of the cases that I'm looking at in detail is the case of the railway rapists and murders, John Duffy and David Mulcahy. I know that you had a very important role in this investigation, which was very complex, involving 3 police forces. Can I come and see you and have a chat about your involvement, please?
Well, certainly. I'd love to see you.
Thank you so much.
No problem. Nice to talk to you, Jackie. Take care.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.
This is the case of John Duffy and David Mulcahy, known as the railway rapists, one of the most complex, complicated cases in British crime history. On the 18th of May, 1986, a young, fresh bride, Anne Locke, went missing on her way back from work in central London to her home in Brookman Park. Paul Dockley was a senior investigating officer in Hertfordshire.
I wasn't on duty, actually, on the 18th, but on the 19th I came on duty to be briefed immediately by the night shift inspector, who was still on duty, who said, we had a strange one last night. There's a lady gone missing. She's recently married. She works for London Weekend Television. She had been called into work unusually on a Sunday. She didn't have a car because her car was being sold. So she borrowed a bike. She lives at an address in Brookman's Park with her husband and her grandmother, and they seem to be a fairly tight unit. She's recently returned from the Seychelles on a honeymoon, been back about 10 days, and she took off to the railway station on the bike. And she bought a ticket, put a bike in the cycle shed, and got the train, which I think was about 3:30 in the afternoon.
So having caught the Underground under Weekend TV is near Waterloo Station,
Absolutely.
so having got the Underground to Finsbury Park,
Yeah.
catching the train then to Brookman's Park, you didn't know, did you, at what point from that journey she would have gone missing from?
No. And yes, we surmise that that was her route home and that's the route she would have taken. But we didn't have any substantial intelligence, data, anything to say she actually got on the train to Brookman's Park.
What was your feeling that this was something different? It wasn't a normal kind of missing from
Yes, it
home?
was, no.
Yeah.
The fact that her cycle was found actually behind the cycle shed, so it had been secreted, in my view. Immediately I was thinking, she's not going to put a bike behind there. Why would the bike be behind the bike shed?
What did you have? What evidence did you have? Did you have any witnesses?
Well, we had a witness who had actually been there the night previously, the Saturday night, a group of witnesses, in fact, who'd gone down on the platform, and there was a bench. As you walk down onto the platform, somebody had put a bench across the steps, as though as to make an obstacle for something, to make it difficult for somebody to get round the bench. But that was of interest to us, because it almost gave some sort of, well, was there some sort of pre-planning going on here? And then at a time around 10 o'clock-ish, somebody in the vicinity of the ticket office heard a scream. But that's all we had.
Evidence for Anne's whereabouts could have been anywhere along her route home, but Paul decided to start the search at Brookman's Park, Anne's intended destination. And that's where we're going now. When you're faced with a rural environment such as this, and you have to search it, if you just look around here, all this grass, nettles, brambles, where do you start?
Right, well, we have experts. In those days, it was called pulsar searching.
Yeah, pulsar.
And these guys gridded the site and actually went, and, you know, just an area from here down to the gate, okay, it doesn't look too much. But when you have to cut it down, so you're either using scythes or strimmers to cut the grass down, and what you're looking for is any evidence. So it could be a ring, it could be a ticket, it could be an item of clothing, a sock, you know, anything, everything we need to actually gather. That's fingertip searching. Well, this particular summer, it was very warm, humid, and as soon as we cut stuff down, it was growing again. So we had teams of maybe 24 guys working either side of the track.
It was indeed you, Paul, who found a relevant piece of evidence belonging to Anne, wasn't it? Can you tell me about that?
Yes, I was getting frustrated, to be perfectly honest with you. 6 weeks into the investigation, we hadn't found anything of Anne's. The search teams, you know, were out most days. And I decided to leave my office from where I was sort of involved in the investigation work. And I'd done it before, and on my own days off, I'd walk the area. But I actually walked down here. I walked to Hawkshead Lane, where I turned left, went over the bridge, and there's a footpath that comes back towards Brookman's Park. And then there's a brook. And as I'm going along the brook, the guys were searching on the ground. And I was in an elevated position, and I was looking up in the tree, and I saw a book. I just saw the leaves of a book blowing in the wind. And then when we took the book off, it was Anne's address book. And at that point, I knew that Anne was here. or I felt in my heart that she was somewhere around in this vicinity. And then the guys started to search further down along the brookside, and they found her diary.
As Paul Dockley and his team continued their search for missing newlywed Anne Locke, unbeknown to them at the time, 2 murder cases would throw a whole new light on their investigation. Months before Anne had disappeared, the body of 15-year-old Dutch national Marta Tamboza had been found near Horsley Station. The case came under Surrey Police Force, and witnesses said they had seen 2 men accost the teenager. She had been raped and strangled with her own belt. But there was a 3rd case. A few months earlier, another missing person case had become a murder inquiry, this time in the Metropolitan Police area of Hackney Wick. On the 29th of December 1985, Alison Day left her home in Upminster to go and visit her boyfriend, who was working on a Sunday in Hackney Wick. It was in the afternoon, and she didn't arrive. In December 1985, an underwater team had uncovered the body of 19-year-old Alison Day in the canal. Her body was found weighted down. She too had been raped and murdered. As a former Met officer, I know this area well, so I'm on my way there now.
Hi, this is a message for Brian Roberts. My name is Jackie Malton, formerly of the Met, and I'm revisiting the case of Alison Day. I believe you were the exhibits officer for that case and know the details of what's happened to her at Frog Island. Would you be happy to meet me at the location?
Hi Jackie, this is Detective Sergeant Brian Roberts. I'm happy to tell you about it. I'll meet you there.
Brian, how close is the railway station where Alison went missing from in relation to where we're standing?
It's probably only about 50 yards up line from this railway bridge.
They forced her to walk on this parapet, which is on the outside of the bridge, what we're looking at.
Exactly.
Which
yes.
is, how wide is that footing?
Probably about 8 inches, I'd suggest, to maybe a foot wide. But of course, the only grips on there are the actual reinforcement struts that stick out from the bridge itself, making it even narrower.
This is real torture, isn't it?
It is, it is. And of course, it resulted in her falling. She made her way to the bank, and that's where they grabbed her again. They walked her down that embankment, and what we do know for certain is that about 200 yards down this embankment, towards the east way, her body was recovered on the 17th of January.
There's evidence when she was recovered that the body had been weighed down by stones.
That's correct. In fact, it was 2 granite sets, which are essentially cobblestones. But unlike sort of the cobblestones you may see that are just sort of a small item, these were maybe 8 inches deep, made of solid granite, so they're quite substantial in weight.
Here we are now, and it's a very busy thoroughfare. Cyclists, pedestrians, lots of activity, London diversity at its best.
Yes.
So in terms of population or frequenting by people in 1985, would it have been kind of bleak, a bit derelict?
This was a bleak, cold, wet place. And it's scary that an individual would drag a girl through this area and then ultimately kill her.
It's just despicable, isn't it?
It is.
After Alison Day's body was recovered, she was taken for a post-mortem, where it was recorded the cause of death was strangulation by use of a tourniquet made from the hem of Alison's own top. There was a large knot tied and placed over her larynx. The pathologist noted this could point to the suspect having an in-depth knowledge of martial arts. I think when you come here and you're in the atmosphere of this place and you see the bridge, you see the canal, you see the footpath, just really brings it home. These two despicable men, what they did to this victim and to other victims is beyond words, to be honest. It's just beyond words. So now we have 3 different police forces investigating 3 women who were disappeared at railway stations, 2 of which were murder inquiries, but none of them knew about each other. The integrated police system, Holmes, wasn't in operation back then, so the only way of linking up these cases was pure luck. And that is exactly what's happened.
I was very lucky in the first few days of the inquiry. I contacted Crime Watch, which was a fairly new program in those days, and I spoke to somebody on the team there and told them that we had this missing person and that she worked for London Weekend Television.
Had Crime Watch ever featured a missing person case before?
No, and I think I'm really lucky to actually get a case onto Crime Watch. Missing persons weren't on their criteria for broadcast. Basically, what happens is that the senior officers responsible for the cases would stand up in front of all the people who were answering the telephones, who again were detectives working from incident rooms, and brief them about their various cases. And it was on this occasion that I sat there and in front of Vince McFadden, who was the Detective Chief Superintendent from Surrey, and Charlie Farquhar, who was the Superintendent from the Met, dealing with Alison Day and Marty Tamboza murders. And I was hit, I think, most certainly by Vince McFadden's account of the abduction and the murder of Marty Tamboza, because he described East Horsley Station, and basically I could see Brookman's Park, in that it was a quiet rural location, nice houses around the area, a footpath that goes alongside the railway line, which is everything that we had in Brookman's Park. And although I was a young detective and they were senior officers, post actually making these presentations, I approached them and said, they'd heard my presentation about Anne going missing from Brookman's Park railway station. And I said, the circumstances are so aligned to yours, in that both your murders are around railway stations and I have a missing person around a railway station. And if you look at the geography around London, it's sort of east, west and northwest. So, I raised the alarm, if you like, but I'm pretty sure that Charles and Vince had already drawn that connection with their 2 cases.
What was their reaction? Because in murder inquiries, as we both know, we're always told to listen to the minority voice, the detective at the back of the room that goes, "Excuse me, Governor," and instead of dismissing them, we actually say, "What have you got to say?" And
they were very receptive. In fact, I was so pleased with their response that I phoned my senior investigating officer and said, I think we should have a meeting with these 2 investigations to see whether we can learn anything from their investigation that's pertinent to ours.
As the 3 forces pooled their resources, the investigation took a dramatic turn. 2 months after Anne Locke had gone missing, her body was found by railway workers. She was just 10 yards outside the police search area near Brookman's Park Station. Paul Dockley's missing person case was now also a murder inquiry. We've returned to the scene to find out what happened. Without going into great detail, because it's distressing, The body, 6 weeks laying dead in humid conditions would not have been a very nice sight, would it?
No, it deteriorated a great deal in that period of time.
How was she identified?
She was identified by her teeth, and there was no physical identification because of the deterioration of the body.
After the body of Anne Locke was found, it strengthened the theory that these 3 murders were committed by the same people. So Surrey, Hertfordshire and the Met continued to work together, but now joined forces with a 4th inquiry that seemed to be linked.
Unbeknown to me, there'd been a series of rapes in London, and this was called the Hart Inquiry, and some really great work had been undertaken by the Met in relation to a series of rapes that occurred in and around railway stations. And they'd really worked hard to try and get to the bottom of these inquiries, but they've been running from 1982, and we were now in 1986.
Was there any indication from any of the victims or witnesses that 2 men, not 1, 2 men, were involved in the rapes?
Yes, there were reports of where 2 men have been involved in assaulting women in and around railway stations. And basically, it's very unusual to have 2 men working together in concert. So, you know, they're actually one, and that's what these women were saying. It was almost like these guys knew what the next move was from the other person.
I think one victim described them as 2 bodies, 1 brain.
Absolutely
because
right.
They were so
Absolutely.
in sync with each other.
Yes, they were. Most of the victims reported that they came off the train and they were comforted by there was a man behind them and a man in front. So almost, you know, they're thinking, I'm being followed, but there's a man in front of me. And the man in front would turn around and grab them and then throw them over a fence. And as we all know, in the areas around railway stations, there's always some scrubland. And that's where the offences were taking place.
All the murders were committed by 2 men near railway stations, and evidence from the Marta Tamboza case suggested a knowledge of martial arts. The police knew that if someone had committed a sexual offence previously, they were likely to do so again. So they turned their attention to a list of known sexual offenders called the Z-Men. With more than 2,000 men on the list, every single one of them had to be found and questioned. One of the names on the list was John Duffy, who had a previous conviction for raping his wife.
Now, I think he was like, say, 1,020 on the list of the Z-Men. And they interviewed him one evening, and the next day they came in and they came into my office and said, we interviewed a guy last night, we're not happy with him.
Why was that?
Don't know why. They didn't know why. They said, I just don't like what I feel.
So somebody comes to you and says, well, I'm not really happy with that. What do you do as detective inspector with that information?
Well, I obviously question them as to why. And they're saying, well, he's a railway worker. He's separated from his wife. They don't have any children. He lives with his mum and dad. He's just odd. He's into martial arts. He didn't want to answer some of our questions, and there was, you know, something that for us wasn't quite right. He said the fact that he's raped his wife as well, so he's like, he has offended sexually previously, and it was agreed that they would go back to West Hampstead Police Station. In those days, they had a Cardex system, and find out as much as they can about him. And when they went to West Hampstead Police Station, they phoned me and they said, you won't believe this, but last night he turns up at West Hampstead Police Station.
After he'd been interviewed by the police?
After he'd been interviewed by the police, he'd been slashed across the chest, beaten up, said he lost his memory. They took him home. He didn't remember his home. He didn't remember his mum and dad. He didn't remember the dog they had. Couldn't remember anything. And he's been sectioned, and he's now in Free and Barnet Hospital. under a mental health order. So we weren't allowed to interview Duffy for 6 months.
For 6 months?
Yeah.
Why?
Because basically he was under medical care, and they were saying, no, you can't interview him. This guy's ill, he's lost his memory, he can't help you anyway because he's lost his memory. And so basically, thank you, but no thank you.
When Duffy was released from hospital, the Joint Police Forces had a surveillance team following his every move.
On one evening, he returned to the site of one of the rapes that was being investigated by the Heart Inquiry. And as a result of returning to that scene, although he didn't do anything, he was in that vicinity, he was arrested. And he was detained, and they went to search his parents' home. And would you believe that during the course of the investigation, Marty Tamboza had been tied from behind with a string called somyan. And somyan is a greasy type string that in the 60s and 70s, Mum would send away her linen to the laundrette, and it would come back wrapped in brown paper tied with this greasy string. And when we took the string to the producers of the string, which I believe was in Holland, they said, this is really unusual because the piece of string is from the end of the loom, and we don't normally use the end of the loom. But if you find the ball of string that this has come from, we will be able to do a mechanical fit. And what we discovered was in the outside toilet, in a bucket, in the house where Duffy was staying, was a ball of somyan. And thankfully, it was a mechanical fit.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
This was enough to charge John Duffy with Marta Tamboza's murder, and all three forces started interrogating him for their respective killings.
Now, John Duffy was happy to talk to us about martial arts, but he wasn't happy to talk. He was saying, I don't remember. I lost my memory. I've been in hospital. I can't remember anything.
What about the string?
Whatever you tell me, I don't know. I can't remember what I've done. So that's what we're faced with. We're faced with somebody who is saying, I have amnesia. I don't know anything. I'll tell you what I like doing. I like doing martial arts.
He didn't lose his memory about that then?
No. And there were other things that he didn't lose his memory about that we know in those 2 weeks that he was out from the hospital, you know, he could still remember his video card, membership number, stuff like that.
Selective.
Very selective.
So he's in custody, he's got memory loss. Police know that when he was younger, he committed some petty offences, let's say, with Mulcahy.
Yeah.
You also know that there may have been two men who had committed the rapes.
Yep.
Was Mulcahy arrested at the same time or just after Duffy?
Yeah. Mulcahy was arrested because we knew that he was Duffy's main contact for anything that they've done previously. They went to school together. They worked. They worked in other criminal enterprises together. They would have been good friends. They went running together. Mulcahy was arrested and interviewed. The thing is that we go back to the precursor to DNA. Duffy was a secretor. He was an A secretor. And we knew that that connected him to some of the victims. Also, both were put on identity parades, and Duffy was picked out by a number of witnesses. Duffy eventually was charged.
What was he charged with?
He was charged with the 3 murders, and I think it was 9 rapes.
Did Duffy face a trial? Did he plead not guilty?
He pleaded not guilty. He was convicted. He went to trial, claiming that he lost his memory, couldn't remember anything.
Was he found guilty?
He was found guilty of the Alison Day and the Marty Tamboza murder.
Why was he found not guilty of your murder?
Because the jury were advised by the judge there was insufficient evidence in which to actually tie him to the Unlock murder.
And so the case of Unlock was kind of closed down. That must have been a real punch in the stomach for you.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I felt for the family, because there's nothing worse than thinking, I've been through all this and the guy's not convicted, but the police believe it's him. You know, very few people understand the judicial process, and they don't understand how a judge, midway through a trial, can say, members of the jury, I want you to discount what you've heard about the Unlock inquiry, you know, because there isn't sufficient evidence in my view.
In 1988, Duffy was locked up. Mulcahy was a free man. That seemed like the end of the matter. But 10 years later, everything changed. The case was reopened. I'm now going to speak to Andy Murphy. Andy Murphy was the detective in charge of Operation Marford, which reinvestigated, if you like, for the first time in British crime history, the original conviction of John Duffy and the investigation into the murders. So this was kind of many years later, fresh eyes looking upon it and the dilemmas and the complexities, problems that he faced. So it's really essential to speak to him, because it was from this investigation that Mulcahy was convicted.
Good afternoon, Andrew speaking.
Oh, hi, Andy. My name's Jackie Malton, a detective from the Met. Andy, I'd love to come and interview you. The reason being that I'm looking at the convictions of Duffy and Mulcahy, very complicated case. You were the detective in charge of Operation Marford. May I come and speak to you and have a chat about your involvement, please?
Yeah, of course. It was a real complex case. As you know, it actually picked up the pieces 10 years after Duffy was arrested and convicted, and Mulcahy was arrested but never convicted. It was a fascinating case.
That summer, there'd been a series of rapes in and around West Hampstead, 6 in total, and it bore all the hallmarks of a previous series that had taken place 10 years ago and that actually resulted in 3 murders. The women were approached from behind. There was no specific profile. The youngest was a schoolgirl, and the oldest was a retired lady. There was increasing confidence in the attacks and an increase in violence. And some of my team at the time had been involved in the original Operation Heart, which had been looking at John Duffy and David Mulcahy. And one of the first things for us was to actually find out whether Duffy had been released. He would have been the prime suspect, but he wasn't. He was still in prison, firmly locked up, not going anywhere. But the intelligence checks showed that a suspect that was originally arrested with Duffy, David Mulcahy, was actually still living in the Hampstead area, in and around where the offences took place. Because of the similarities, made a decision that we would arrest Mulcahy, interview him, and obtain a DNA profile, because we had profiles on the Mulcahy was arrested, but the profile came back as negative. He wasn't the Loudwater suspect.
Another man was found to be the Loudwater suspect, and he was tried and convicted. Mulcahy walked free yet again.
Midweek, one afternoon, the phone went in the office, and it was the scientist from the Loudwater series, from the FSS. And what she'd managed to do was actually to go back to historic exhibits.
With the new DNA?
With the new DNA profile. And she rang him and said, Andy, just ringing to tell you that we've got Mulcahy's profile on some clothing from one of the victims back in the 80s.
Wow.
It was, gee, you know, Christ, what do we do now?
So you've got this information. So what was your strategy then?
I think when it first comes through, you think, great, you know, we've got a DNA profile. And then when you actually think it through and chatting with Liz about the exhibit that she'd found, the exhibit was a 10-year-old exhibit. Records had shown that the exhibit should have gone on for destruction, but it hadn't been. And so really, in terms of a prosecution, it was pretty worthless.
Because the defence would get hold of that and there would be some form of allegations of contamination, lack of continuity, it should have gone off for disposal.
Absolutely.
And so therefore you would have lost it on the first knockings.
Yeah, absolutely. But it also threw up, what do we now do with Mulcahy? For the first time, we had concrete proof that he was at the very least a rapist, possibly a murderer. He was still on the streets of London. What do you do?
Had John Duffy, at this time, who'd been in prison for obviously 10 years, indicated at any point, A, you know, his guilt, and B, that somebody else was involved with him?
Sure, he had. He'd started to talk about the offendings. He was undergoing psychological counselling by psychologist Jenny Cutter. And during those interviews, Duffy was starting to talk initially about the race. He'd named Mulcahy, and over a period of time, he went on to talk about the murders.
When Duffy began to open up about the and murders, he inexplicably began reenacting every minute detail. His accounts were so disturbing that one young officer present at the questioning went on sick leave and eventually left the force. Why didn't you go and knock on his door?
I think, again, if you look at that confession, if you look at John Duffy, he wasn't your perfect witness. He was probably the worst witness you could get. He was a convicted rapist, a convicted murderer. He was now saying that when I was arrested back in the 80s and claimed that I was beaten up and had amnesia, I lied. When I went to the Old Bailey, I lied. I didn't have amnesia. I just couldn't find a way out of it. But I did develop amnesia because I couldn't deal with what I've done. So I switched everything off, and for a number of years, I denied that I was that and that murderer.
Because he couldn't face it?
Because he couldn't face it. And then through Jenny Cutler, he was gradually piecing things back together. But for us, a convicted rapist, murderer, liar, lied at the Bailey, didn't have amnesia, developed amnesia, now talking to a psychologist, it's not worth the paper it's written on.
I've been down to Hackney Wick, in actual fact, to look at the bridge where the murder of Alison Day had occurred at that railway station, and it was indicated that she was forced to walk on the outside of that bridge. And just looking at that bridge, it was horrific just to look at it. And how on earth did this girl do it in the freezing cold? Was this one of the other elements you had to disprove?
Yeah, well, that actually came up during the trial. In the middle of the trial, Duffy had given his account, exactly as you say, that Alison had been captured off the train, taken underneath the bridge. Duffy had raped her, Mulcahy hadn't. She was made to dress in the dark. She was then taken back up the railway bank, and Mulcahy made her edge, as you say, along the outside of the bridge. So if you can imagine looking across the railway lines with the canal behind her. There's absolutely no reason for that. That she got 3/4 of the way across, fell into the canal, scrambled up. And the defence said, well, this is physically impossible. You can't do that. So that afternoon, we scooted back down to Hackney Wick, and we got one of the WDCs, the detective constables from the team. She dressed in clothing similar to Alison, and she actually edged away across the railway bridge. And we recorded that, took it back to court to show that it was physically possible. At the time, a train went by. So Alison must have been going through, you just can't imagine. But we were able to show that it was physically possible, despite the thought that this can't happen. It could.
Despite the time constraints and Mulcahy denying everything, Andy managed to build a watertight case. And with Duffy's now believable evidence, Mulcahy and Duffy were both found guilty. They received life sentences for 14 rapes and the murders of all 3 women, Marta Tamboza, Alison Day and Anne Locke. I have never come across 2 men committing such abhorrent and torturous crimes as these, and I can't begin to understand what motivated them. So I'm hoping forensic psychologist Dr. Julian Boone can shed some light on these evil partners in crime. In your experience, how frequent is it that two men operate together in crimes like that of rape and murder?
It is comparatively rare. It's not rare in various crimes for two men to operate together, say, just take an ordinary example, armed robbery, say, or something like that. That's very common. But to work together in this way and have had such an extraordinary bond from the age of 11 years old, which was when I gather they met, and to escalate through relatively petty crimes to a series of and murder is quite uncommon for two to be joined at the hip in that way.
What I found fascinating is that it took a number of years before Duffy started to open up and talk about another person and being involved. In your experience dealing with men in prison, is that kind of common, not common?
Not common, but what I would say is that it weren't just to be in the therapy, in my view, that caused him to open up and implicate Mulcahy. It would have been the fact that he knows that he was going to stand a cat in hell's chance of ever getting out of prison. He's got to be cooperative. Always be suspicious about motives. When people who do such ghastly things for years and then get banged up and they suddenly realise, well, Mulcahy's out there, he's all right, he thinks he's invincible, and I'm going to be stuck in here forever. So what if I help the authorities? And then, in so doing, perhaps they'll give me an earlier release.
This case was huge in scope and incredibly complicated. But all the detectives and officers involved never forgot the human side. 14 women's lives were changed forever, and 3 were tortured and brutally killed. I know from personal experience that some cases get under your skin, and leaving them behind can be really tough. So I think the final word should go to Paul Dockley, who investigated the murder of Anne Locke, a case I know affected him deeply.
I've never forgotten this day in 33 years. And in that 6-week period till I found her book, an 8-week period till we found her body, she was part of my life. Absolutely part of my life. I knew her husband, Lawrence. I knew her grandmother. I knew Lawrence's mum, dad. I knew all her friends. She's almost like written into your history. You have to try and compartmentalise everything. It's not easy. You know, I was mortified. I probably knew that that was going to be the outcome after 8 weeks of no contact. And she wasn't a lady that would disappear like that. So it was inevitable in many respects, but she was part of my life and still is.